HP Lion Roar PT-7. The Dark Lord Voldemort sat upon his great high back seat in the Great Hall watching over his young flock. He felt great inspiration for his new world as he watched them all eating in silence, avoiding looking at him, at least not directly. There wasn't even the hint of whispers as they ate their breakfast. So very different from when he'd been a boy in that very room. Apparently it had gotten out that their master was a Legilimens and no one wanted their deepest teen secrets exposed. Not that their great lord wished to know who loved who, or who lusted after who or who had groped who in a broom closet. Those secrets did not matter at all to the Dark Lord. What he truly wished to know was who among his flock still resisted him. He had all but unleashed his Death Eaters upon the students to bring them under control. Many Muggleborns had been made example of in order to prove to the rest that he was very sincere in his wish to show them the light, as it were. Still, there were small outbursts of rebellion, fueled, Lord Voldemort was sure, by the remaining original Hogwarts teachers. Of the original staff, only 5 remained. Snape, who was one of his most loyal followers. He'd been granted the honor of teaching the dark arts to the young. Snape had even made his students practice upon one another. McGonagall was allowed to continue, but only as there was no one better to teach Transfiguration. This was the same for Sprout, Flitwick, and Slughorn. Though Slughorn was allowed to live for more sentimental reasons. Slughorn had even dined with the Dark Lord, and Voldemort had enjoyed the teacher's company, just as he had when he was a boy. The only other member of the original staff remaining was the school matron, Pomfret. The school had run fairly smoothly over the last few months, though the Dark Lord did have to suffer the whining complaints about children missing their families and wishing to return home. Many of those were Muggleborns, and they had only complained once. The herd had then had to be thinned. But now, order reigned. 3 chimes sounded and as one, the students rose and began to exit the Great Hall to attend classes. It was time for more lessons in superiority. These young unfolded minds had yet to come to understand their true place in the scheme of the universe, but they would soon. Lord Voldemort rose to his feet, and he felt the comforting coolness of his familiar Nagini, slithering across his feet. He looked done, a small, rather sinister smile on his serpentine-like face. Yes, his grand vision was coming together. The previous evening, Rudolphus had come to him, requesting to face the Longbottom boy who had issued a challenge. It seemed the child of the great Auror Frank Longbottom wished to avenge his family once and for all. Lord Voldemort, of course, approved for Rudolphus to engage the boy on the condition that he find out where Harry Potter was hiding. The boy was the final obstacle, and once Longbottom was finished, he would have no allies left to him. At least not anyone worthy of bother. It was merely a matter of time before he had Potter kneeling before him, at long last. The Great Hall finally emptied, and the Dark Lord began to return to his throne room. He was still searching to the perfect solution to his problem, though he was still convinced he needed Potter. He felt that Potter's blood was the key to his problem of lessened power. As he made his way to his private quarters, he began to feel something disturbing. His vision swam a bit, and his head spun. If he had eaten, he was sure his meal would be returning up his throat. He flexed his fingers and tried to steady his breathing. His heart raced in his thin chest, and he clutched the front of his robes in a vain effort to keep himself upright. That's when he saw Nagini seemed to be in pain. His precious snake was hissing and squirming, though it looked to Lord Voldemort's eyes that she was becoming normal again, and that's when it hit him. How had he been so blind? Realization hit him with the force of a giant's kick to his face. He'd been a fool all this time. It was all suddenly clear. It wasn't Potter's blood that had been poisoning him, and robbing him of his great strength all this time. It never had been. It was something far more worrisome. Far more frightening. When his vision cleared, and his heart rate slowed to normal once again, he moved as fast as he could to his quarters. As he raced, his mind wandered back to his youth, to the day he'd found the answer to his worst fear. The secret to cheating death. The single word that would make him immortal. Horcrux. Questions began racing through his mind. How had the boy found out his secret? How could anyone? Somehow, the Dark Lord reasoned, Dumbledore must have discovered his secret and passed the information on to the boy. Potter had been destroying all of the Horcruxes, and that was what was causing him to lose his strength. It all made sense to him now. His strength had grown proportionately with each Horcrux made, as he'd protected and strengthened his soul fragments. How could he have been so blind all this time? He should have known all along that power did not lie in the blood. He was a half-blood and much more powerful than any pure blood. Blood was not the secret. It had always been the soul. The soul that he'd gone to such great lengths to protect. To keep from succumbing to death. The soul had always been the key. How many of his Horcruxes had been destroyed? He needed to know for sure, and any that were left, he had to gather to him and protect. As soon as Lestrange returned, he would send him to Gringotts and retrieve the cup. That one at least was safe. There was no way Potter would be able to get into another's vault. But the others, the ring, the diary, the diadem, and the locket. They all needed to be checked on. There was no time to lose. The Dark Lord turned on his heel and headed straight for the front gates. He had many places to visit, and little time in which to do it. After all, his mortality was at risk now. Harry stood alone in his bedroom staring out onto the beach where many of the Bulgarians were milling around, playing games or enjoying the sunshine. On any other occasion, one might think this was a great summer vacation spot, not a large group of soldiers preparing for one big strike against their enemy. Harry saw a few of their scouts apparate on the shore and begin running towards the house with the latest intelligence. It had been quite a day. He and Sirius had actually found one more Horcrux and destroyed it, and Neville had killed Lestrange and gained their family fortune. The letter from Gringotts had arrived just after dinner. Neville was still unconscious, but the 4 healers that had come as part of a group from France, had told them all that he would survive, and likely be awake the very next day. It was plausible that they could have the final Horcrux in their hands in a matter of days. The cup of Helga Hufflepuff, which they believed to be resting in the Lestrange vaults, now the Longbottom vaults. And then only Voldemort remained. But that wasn't what was troubling Harry this evening, as he watched the sun slipping down over the ocean. What was bothering him was Neville and Hermione. 2 of the people Harry had leaned on and had supported Harry through all the war. Who'd nearly lost their lives. Harry felt that they had done far too much and that perhaps, it was time for them to leave. To have a chance for a real life, together. There you are. Harry turned to see Daphne standing in their doorway. She smiled at him and shut the door behind her as she came closer to him, reaching up to caress his cheek. She was wearing her swimsuit with a pair of shorts over them. Harry couldn't help but smile at the vision before him. He took her hand as she offered it, and pulled her into a warm embrace, inhaling her sweet scent. "What's on your mind?" she asked softly, allowing herself to lose herself a bit in his embrace. Harry started to shake his head, but Daphne pulled out of his arms and grabbed his face in both hands. "Don't try and shut me out now," she said gently. "I know that look. Something's eating you, and for once it isn't me." Her joke got him to smile, and even more importantly, to relax. Daphne could see his shoulders drop a fraction and even feel his tension ebb away just a bit. "I was just thinking about Neville and Hermione." Harry sighed, his hand cupping hers as she held his face. I was thinking that maybe it's time for them to move on. That their war is over. They've already done far too much and I can't ask them to do any more. Are you going to attempt to send me away as well? Daphne asked sincerely. Like I could. I still remember you showing up at my aunt's house and punching me in the face to make sure I understood that we weren't going to break up. And, I'm thankful for that. You didn't give up on me, and you've been the best thing in my life. You did need some sense knocked into you. And that might happen again if you keep up this line of thinking. You can't honestly believe that those two will just smile, nod and agree that they've done enough and go on their merry way, do you? Do you really think that they'll thank you and pack their bags and go to the mainland? Harry had to shake his head. Daphne was right and he knew it. Hermione was likely to try and hex him for even suggesting it. It's admirable that you want to fight this war alone, Daphne said, guiding him to sit on their bed. But it isn't just your fight. For whatever reason, we're all fighting for something. Those people on the beach who don't even live in this country are fighting to keep terrorism away from their homes. There are people fighting just to reunite their own families. Hermione and Neville, they're fighting because it's the right thing to do. Because they believe in something greater than themselves. You fight because there is now a way you'd be able to live with yourself if you knew people were suffering and you could do something about it. And you? Harry asked, looking deep into Daphne's dark eyes. She gave a simple, soft smile as she leaned in and kissed his lips. She gripped his hair as she deepened the kiss, feeling his arm slip around her waist and draw her closer. When they finally pulled apart, Daphne smiled and stared at Harry pointedly. I'm fighting for my future. With you. She said sweetly. And what did you have in mind? Harry smiled as Daphne pushed him back on their bed and straddled his torso. I was thinking, a house, on the ocean I think. Something like this but a little bigger, she smirked, her fingers entwining his as she bent forward and buried her head into the crook of his neck, her lips brushing softly against his neck, causing him to shiver. Daphne loved when she got him to shiver. Bigger? Why would we need something bigger? Harry asked breathily. You don't honestly think that we're going to be married and not have at least 3 children, do you? She grinned, tracing a thin line along his collarbone with her tongue. 3? He asked, a fiery glint in his eye as parts of him started to really react to his girlfriend's manipulations, especially her hips grinding slowly against his. Yes. Why, should we have more? Should we try for 4? 5? Daphne breathed as she kissed her way up his neck and along his jaw. I don't really know. Harry tried to say, his brain losing the necessary blood flow to really think about anything. Even if he had, Daphne didn't really want to hear his thoughts. Her hands had slipped under his shirt and were slowly and sensually running up and down his chest. Her lips had captured his, and her tongue was begging for entrance. Harry's hands ran up her arms, his fingers curled and hooked the straps of her swimsuit and began to pull them off her shoulders and down her arms. Daphne, pleased that Harry was getting the message, slipped her arms free and began pulling his t-shirt up his body, nearly ripping it off his body in her growing excitement. Harry's last conscious thought before his primal instincts took over was to wonder if Daphne had cast a silencing charm when she'd entered the room. This plan of Harry's, Amelia Bones said, looking over a dozen different maps. It's crazy. Brilliant, but crazy. Yeah. Mad Eye Moody smiled, though it looked more like a grimace. I like it. It's solid. Remus pointed out. Simultaneous attacks at 50 locations. The Death Eater forces will be spread pretty thin, and there's no way they could anticipate this kind of ambush. He's going to use the students as shields. Amelia said, looking up the others in the room with her. Sirius Black stood in a corner watching her, his arms folded across his chest. Remus and Tonks sat across from her, examining some of the maps laid out on the large table between them, while Moody was going over a list of supplies they had accumulated. Sebastian Delacour and Victor Crumb were both sitting nearby, simply listening to the others. Of course he is. Sirius spoke up. He's a coward, but Harry already anticipated that. You heard his plan. Mooney's right, it's solid. I just wish there was another way. A way that wouldn't put children at risk. Amelia sighed. We all do. Sebastian said, turning to look at them all in turn. But this plan is the very best we have, and it will keep the casualties to a minimum. Monsieur Potter seems to believe that the Dark Lord's belief that he is untouchable will have made him complacent. We should have no difficulty in getting in place. Then we have but to wait for the signal, and end your war once and for all. Our initial attack will likely cripple him, and we should face very little resistance. Tonks said, tossing a map onto the table. Personally, I'm hoping the cowards will simply give up altogether when they realize that they're overwhelmed. I think it depends on who the Dark Lord keeps at his side. The more fanatical will of course fight until we kill them. Moody remarked. Sirius! Susan Bones shouted as she entered the room. She had a letter clutched in her hands which she held out to Sirius. An owl just showed up with this. It's a Hogwarts owl. Sirius practically leapt from the corner and took the letter from Susan, who took a step back to keep from getting knocked over by Moody, who stomped towards Sirius. Sirius tore the envelope open and ripped out the letter. Sirius began reading out loud. I don't know why, but the Dark Lord has left the castle. This is the only time I will be able to get word to you without fear of the letter being intercepted. Unfortunately, all the exits out of the school have been sealed, and I cannot get any students out. I do not know if Longbottom has yet to face Lestrange, but I believe that he will be triumphant, as I have been slowly poisoning the oaf since the incident at Greengrass Manor. I don't know if it's been long enough yet, as I could not keep up a regular dosage, but it should have made it easier. Many of the youngest Muggleborns have been killed. Of the nearly 300 students who did not escape, only 213 remain. Most of the original staff have been killed as well. Hagrid has hidden in the mountains beyond the Forbidden Forest, though I have been unable to get word to him. Hogsmeade is under strict control, as is the Ministry. If you are able to communicate with your godson, please tell him that he must finish his task, for all our sakes. I am unable to do any more to save the students. I have risked much and am now under much suspicion. Though he has not said it, I believe the Dark Lord himself may now suspect me of subterfuge. If nothing is done soon, I fear we will not hold out much longer. The new students are set to arrive September 1st, and the Dark Lord's forces are already being put in place to make sure no one tries to flee. It is our hope that you are preparing to do something and to do it soon. Severus Snape. The new students? Tonks asked, looking puzzled. No doubt that you know who's looked at the register and knows who is expected to walk through those doors. Moody growled. Recruits for his new world order. We need to do everything we can to prevent him from taking more children. Amelia said determinedly. We can't let any more families to be torn apart. So, Sirius said, folding the letter and looking at each of the leaders of the order in turn. How soon can we make our move? Neville opened his eyes, and knew for sure that he was in heaven. That was the only way that he would be seeing Hermione peacefully reading a book in the window. Her brown curls were a gorgeous burgundy thanks to the setting sun. She was nibbling on her bottom lip, a sure sign that she was reading something that had her mind working hard. She looked a little tired, but peaceful. Neville wondered how long he'd been gone. He wished that he could touch her again. To brush those soft curls from her eyes, and inhale her sweet vanilla scent. Simply to hold her hand and tell her how beautiful she was. To just one more time, kiss her soft lips. "I love you," he whispered. Hermione turned suddenly at the sound of his voice, and a soft smile appeared on her lips. "Oh, Neville." Hermione sighed, dropping her book and rushing over to him. She took his hand in both of hers and kissed it. He could feel her soft lips on his hand and the warmth of her hands around his. His heart began to beat faster at the look of happiness in her watery eyes. "I've been so worried. Mad Eye said that Harry got to you just in time, and the healers were sure that you'd be fine and we had to be patient, but I was still so scared. There was so much blood, and you were so pale." I'm alive?" Neville asked, clearly surprised at the fact that he had not in fact crossed over. His mind reeled at the fact that he was alive. His heart still beat and he still drew breath. "Lestrange?" he asked, his throat hoarse. His eyes grew wide with worry. He had to know if he'd actually accomplished what he'd set out to do or if his enemy managed to escape his fate. The last thing he remembered was driving Harry's sword into Lestrange's throat. "You did it, Neville," Hermione said, tears slipping down her cheeks, her cinnamon-colored eyes beaming with pride. "You beat him." Neville started to sit up, and Hermione helped him, and then poured him a glass of water. He drank it down as if it was the most wonderful thing he'd ever tasted. When he'd finished it, she poured another, which he sipped a bit slower. "How long have I been out?" he asked. He expected that he'd been out for a few weeks and was given a serious shock when Hermione answered. "Since we found you around noon. Harry and Sirius came back from Grimmauld Place and Harry insisted that since you weren't back, that we needed to go get you. Harry managed to heal your biggest wound, and the healers worked on you for a couple of hours, mostly replenishing your blood. They thought you would sleep through the night, but I wasn't going to leave your side until you woke up." Neville smiled at this and nodded, remembering the promise Harry had made before he'd left to meet his destiny. "A letter from Gringotts arrived at dinner," Hermione said, reaching over to the bedside table and handing him an envelope with the bank's seal. Neville held it for a moment, but placed it at his side and turned back to Hermione. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry that I put you through that." Hermione quickly brought her fingers up to his lips, silencing him and shaking her head. "No apologies," she said. "I told you last night, I understand. I didn't agree with it, but I understood. It's over now, and we can move forward." "No, we can't." Neville shook his head slowly. "Not until the war is over, and you know who is dead. Then we can move forward. We can finish school, and—" Hermione had suddenly pressed her lips hard to Neville's. She clutched his shoulders as she couldn't get a good grip on him from the angle she was at. "Do you mean it?" she asked when she pulled away from him. "You'll finish school with me?" "Of course," Neville said, a bit surprised. He realized in that second that they had never actually discussed what they would do when the war was over. He had always assumed that they would return to Hogwarts for their 7th year and finish their education and take the Newts before heading out into the world for real. He had always known just how important education was to Hermione, and had never questioned that that was their plan. Given her reaction, Hermione was extremely pleased by this. "And when are you going to propose to me?" she asked, tears still falling down her cheeks, though clearly they were happy tears. "Just as soon as I get a ring for you." "A proper proposal, that's what you wanted, so that's what you'll get. He smiled, taking her in his arms, and pulling her across his lap. Hermione didn't fight, she just simply wrapped her hands around his neck, smiling brightly at his words. They held each other in silent joy for a few minutes before Hermione spoke again. Harry's been locked in his room ever since we found out you'd be okay. That can't be good. Neville sighed into her hair. He felt Hermione nod at his statement. I agree. I think he might try and ask us to leave. After all we've been through, he might try and get us to go and try and have some sort of life, that our part in this war is done. Well, that's not going to happen, Neville said firmly, pulling back to look in Hermione's eyes. She nodded. She slipped off his lap, but stayed close to him on their bed. We're so close to ending the entire war, there's no way we can walk away. We all started this together, it would be wrong if we all don't see it to the end, no matter what happens. Hermione said. She turned her eyes to their entwined hands. I'm scared. About what? After we get the last Horcrux, we'll have to fight him. The final battle. I hate that I keep thinking about it so negatively, but I keep wondering if we'll all make it. We're trained, Neville said flatly. But, you know as well as I do, things happen. If we keep our heads, trust in each other, I believe we'll make it. Look what we've done already, all we've done, and seen. I love your optimism. She sighed, curling up in his arms. You should try and get some rest. The healers will check on you in the morning, and then we can figure out what needs to be done next. I don't know if I can sleep, Neville said, though he yawned, betraying himself. The truth was, he was afraid that this was all a dream, and when he closed his eyes, he'd learn he had not survived his battle at all. Hermione seemed to know what he was thinking. It'll be okay, love. I'll be right here when you wake up. Right by your side where I've always been. She softly kissed his lips and curled next to him. Slowly, he closed his eyes and sleep claimed him much faster than he would have liked, and despite everything, he slept very peacefully. Diagon Alley was all but a ghost town these days. Very few of the shops had managed to remain open after the coup of the Death Eaters, and only those that had been able to pay the new taxes. Florian Fortescue's ice cream shop was boarded up, as was Ollivander's, Aesop's, and the apothecary. Flourish and Blotz was still open, though it appeared they were close to closing up, as was Madame Malkin's. There was a large store that had been burned down, leaving the charred ruin behind. I never even got to see it when it was up and running, Harry murmured, looking at the ruin of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. He, Daphne, Hermione and Neville were glancing around the alley on their way to Gringotts. It had only been a day since Neville had been deemed fully recovered by the healers, and though he hadn't admitted it, Neville still felt tired. He still had to take potions, but he was told only for a few more days. Come on, Harry, Daphne said sadly, with a bit of trepidation in her voice as well. Let's do what we got to do. Harry tugged his hood a little, making sure his face was pretty well covered as they approached the marble stairs leading to the Wizarding Bank. There were 4 hulking trolls stationed around the doors, sniffing the air suspiciously and watching the 4 teens as they approached. 2 large pikes fell across the doors, barring the youngsters' access to the bank. Neville stepped forward, dropping his hood. I am Neville Longbottom, and I wish to visit my vaults. One of the trolls gave a low grumble and bent forward, sniffing the boy. Neville took out his vault key and held it up, and the troll snorted and stood up. The pikes came up and Neville and his friends entered the bank. Gotten a bit paranoid, haven't they? Daphne said. Harry felt her hand shivering just a bit in his hand. Can you blame them? Hermione asked as the great doors shut behind them. I've no doubt that you know who's been leaning on them. Let's keep focused. We've got a long day ahead of us. Neville sighed, heading to one of the many open counters. Good morning, Neville said. The irritated-looking goblin looked up, folding his long fingers over his other hand. His piercing black eyes appeared to be trying to see through Neville, who ignored the attempt at intimidation. After facing down all the Lestranges, Neville didn't think he'd ever be intimidated by anyone ever again. I am here to claim the Lestrange vault, Neville said, handing the letter he'd received to the goblin, who raised an eyebrow. The goblin took the letter and quickly scanned it, before eyeing Neville again, and snapping his fingers. Bloodfang will help you, the goblin said simply, handing the letter back to Neville, who bowed at the neck and spoke in gobbledygook, which made the goblin's eyebrows raise up in surprise. Neville turned and saw another well-dressed goblin heading towards him and his friends. What did you say to him? Hermione asked, still looking at the impressed-looking goblin. I thanked him, and wished him great fortune. Gran felt it wise to respect the goblins, and part of that respect was learning the language. She made me take lessons since I could speak English. Neville shrugged. My parents did too, Daphne said flatly. Dad always said that if you want them to really help you, show them proper respect. Good morning, young wizards. Bloodfang snarled as he approached. How might I be of service to you today? Neville handed the letter to the little goblin, and repeated his request to take control of the Lestrange vault by right of retribution. Bloodfang read the letter and read it through. He eyed Neville for a moment, and then asked the identities of his companions. Once Neville introduced everyone, the goblin nodded, though his eyes remained on Harry. Harry tensed, though he had no clear reason to feel anxious. Follow me, Bloodfang said, handing the key back to Neville. Neville pocketed his key and they followed the goblin to the carts. He told the teens to wait there for a moment and he headed into a small round door. After a few minutes, the goblin returned with 3 very large ledgers tucked under his arm. He guided the teens into a cart, and waited for them to get settled. Without warning, the cart shot off, and the 4 teens barely managed to hang on. Hermione began shrieking in terror as the cart made several death-defying hairpin turns, and long steep drops. Harry felt Daphne gripping his arm, her face buried in his chest. All Harry could think was that he hoped that Daphne didn't throw up. Neville and Harry, in contrast to their girlfriends, were all smiles. For Harry this was very close to how he flew. Neville on the other hand had always loved riding the carts. As he had come from a very old family, his family vault was in one of the deeper parts of the bank. He had often begged his grandmother to join her whenever she had bank business, just in the hopes that he would get to ride the carts. Harry! Neville yelled over Hermione's shrieks of terror. Harry turned to look at Neville, and had to laugh at Hermione's stark white face and bulging eyes. Is it true Muggles have rides like this in their amusement parks? Harry nodded and Neville's eyes lit up in excitement. After another 5 minutes, the cart finally came to a stop and the goblin climbed out of the cart, turning to stare at the teens with mild contempt. Bloodfang was always annoyed by humans' reactions in the carts. He waited as patiently as he could for the young humans to collect themselves. It's okay, Hermione. Neville grinned, trying to pull her hands off of the bar in front of her. We're stopped. I've never liked these things. Daphne panted, loosening her grip on Harry. So, you're saying you wouldn't go on a roller coaster with me? Harry asked, smirking as he rose from his seat. Daphne scowled at her boyfriend who would not stop smiling. Neville turned to Bloodfang who looked as if he was getting more and more perturbed. He wasn't worried about the goblin. He knew the attitude was going to change in a few moments. Vault 109, formerly belonging to the ancient and most noble house of Lestrange. Bloodfang said clearly. Harry looked and saw that they weren't in front of a vault, but rather the mouth of a cave. He could hear something coming from the dark of the cave, that sent the hairs on the back of his neck to stand on end. Bloodfang went back to the cart and pulled out a chain with two large metal blocks on them, and turned back to the cave. This way. The group started heading into the cave, while Bloodfang shook the chain, causing the metal block to slam together loudly. "What's going on?" Hermione asked. The older the vault, the more protections placed on them. Many of the ancient and noble houses have a dragon guarding the vault itself, on top of all the other protective charms and whatnot. Neville said matter-of-factly. "We have a dragon in front of ours. The chain makes it back away from the vault," Neville pointed out. As soon as Neville finished his sentence, the cave opened up and Bloodfang gave a wave of his arm, lighting several torches. Harry, Hermione, Neville, and Daphne caught a glimpse of a very large, white tail slipping around a corner and into another cave. "Whoa!" Harry said, fighting a chill. The tail of the dragon was incredibly huge, and Harry wondered how much bigger the Gringotts dragon was in comparison to the Hungarian horntail he'd flown against in his 4th year. "I have here the Lestrange ledger," Bloodfang said, holding out one of the 3 ledgers to Neville before going to the vault door and opening it for Neville. Neville led his friends into the vault where they all immediately began looking for the cup of Helga Hufflepuff. "Bloodfang?" Neville asked, inviting the goblin inside the vault. "Yes, Master Longbottom." "I'd like all of the gold moved into the Longbottom vault immediately," Neville said. Glancing at the goblin before scanning the vault for any sign of the cup, he caught Harry going deeper into the vault, while Daphne and Hermione were actually examining items closely. "All the weapons and armor I'd like to have returned to the Goblin Nation." Bloodfang nearly dropped the ledgers he carried at this statement, and Neville saw Hermione turn and look at Neville strangely. "I'd also like anything else that was forged in the Goblin Nation returned as well." "Young master is very generous." "May I inquire as to why?" Bloodfang asked, looking with deepest suspicion at Neville, who looked back at the goblin with confidence. "I have no use for these items, and I would rather see them back in the hands of those who truly appreciate their craftsmanship, than in other vaults, lost for eternity. I have dealt with wizards for many years, Master Longbottom, but still, some of you manage to surprise me." Harry was now quite deep in the vault, his eyes half closed. He was allowing his senses to guide him to the Horcrux. Slowly he walked, turning at the waist almost as if he were a walking radar. He'd felt the sickening pull of the dark object almost as soon as the vault opened, though it was quite weak. But with every step he took, the aura of darkness grew. He knew without a doubt that he was nearing Voldemort's Horcrux. The aura made him sick to his stomach, and he felt inexplicably dirty, like he needed 10,000 screaming hot showers to boil off several layers of flesh just to be clean once again. He vaguely wondered if all dark wizards' magic signature felt this. Wrong. Following the pull of the dark aura, Harry finally stopped at a large pile of trunks in the furthest corner of the vault. He opened his eyes fully and looked up. There were at least 6 trunks, similar to the ones he and his friends used at school, stacked on top of one another. Harry saw bits of cloth hanging out of 2 or 3 and guessed that they might have had ancient gowns or some such nonsense in them. Next to the stack was a rather regal suit of gold armor with what looked like runes etched into it. There was a jeweled scabbard at its side, though there was no sword in it. Harry's eyes scanned over the mounds of gold and jewels and saw a few paintings and what appeared to be books, though he couldn't tell for sure. He closed his eyes and centered himself to make sure he wasn't mistaken, and was pleased to find that Voldemort's signature was strongest here where he stood. "Guys!" he called. "I think it's over here." Hermione was the first to reach him, followed by Neville Bloodfang and finally Daphne. "I don't see it," Neville said. "It's here. It might be in one of those trunks, but it's here." "Right then," Neville said. With a flick and swish, the topmost trunk hovered down in between them all. To their surprise, sitting on top of the trunk was a single gold cup, emblazoned with a badger. "We found it," Hermione sighed, clasping Neville's arm and kissing him on the cheek. Harry reached out and plucked up the cup, handing it to Daphne, who shoved it into a small handbag. Neville turned to Bloodfang and bowed. "Good sir, I have one more request of you before I conclude my business." Bloodfang arched an eyebrow, and waited for Neville to make his last request. "I would very much like it if you would honor my family and become my personal account manager. Once you've accomplished all that I have asked of you, I would like it if you would liquidate all remaining assets formally of House Lestrange, and keep the profits for yourself personally." The goblin's eyes bugged, and he actually fell to the floor, clutching his chest. "Master Longbottom, you should be aware that after the gold and goblin-made items, there is still well over 300 million galleons worth of equity." "Really?" Neville looked at the goblin, then shrugged. "I hope you find a very good use for it. It is my sincerest wish that with you as my account manager, our fortunes will flourish." "Of that, I have no doubt, Master Longbottom." Bloodfang bowed low and then handed Neville a second ledger. "This is the current status of the Longbottom fortune, now including the gold which has not yet been moved from this vault. I also took the liberty to retrieve the Potter Lech," Bloodfang said, looking to Harry, whose eyes went wide. "Your investments have done very well over the last 16 years, and I think you'll find your family holdings quite to your satisfaction." Bloodfang had been correct. Harry hadn't thought about his money situation since Dumbledore had retrieved him from the Dursleys that last time and indicated that Harry was quite wealthy. According to the ledger, Harry's trust vault was still well over 300,000 galleons. His family vault, which he had not yet seen himself, was bulging at nearly 700 million galleons. That wasn't even counting real estate and business investments. "Wow!" was all Harry could say at the moment. "Listen you two," Hermione said, snapping her fingers and getting both Harry's and Neville's attentions. "I'm sure this is all very interesting, and will need addressed at some point, but we do have some things to finish before that can happen." "The girl's right," Daphne said, closing Harry's ledger. Harry nodded solemnly and handed the account book back to Bloodfang. "Sir, I would very much like to go over everything with you so I fully understand it all. As my very esteemed friend, Mr. Longbottom has entrusted you with his accounts, I would also like to retain your services, though at this moment, I do not yet know what I can offer you. As Master Longbottom has pretty much assured my fortunes, I will be most willing to help out Hose Potter. I have no doubt your noble house will remember my efforts in the future." Harry saw Neville's eyes widen in surprise, but felt it would be smart not to ask just yet. "I thank you," Harry said, giving a bow to the goblin, who returned it. They then left the vault and headed back to the cart for a very fast and loud ride back to the bank's main office. They headed out to the alley where they could apparate a way back to the Flamel House to await word for the next part of their plan to be able to move forward. Just as Harry and his friends had finally laid hands on the cup of Helga Hufflepuff, Sirius stood in a forest clearing about 70 miles outside of London. His group was finalizing their preparations and getting themselves situated under cover so they wouldn't be seen when their guests arrived. Sirius checked his watch to make sure they weren't running behind. "Let's move it, people. 10 minutes. Mad-Eye Moody unsheathed his wand and gave it a flick. Pleased with the gold sparks, he gave a smile that looked to the casual observer like a grimace of pain. The old Auror shouted at one of his Bulgarian charges to make sure he was ready to throw up the wards as soon as their prey entered the clearing. Moody pulled out his ancient pocket watch and nodded. Just 8 minutes to go. Remus Lupin gripped his wand, making sure he had a clear line of sight while keeping himself out of sight. He wished they could move farther away from the Muggle neighborhood, but there should be little notice, thanks to the wards he and some of the others had placed, to keep the Muggles away. 7 minutes. He whispered to himself, watching as the volunteer stepped into the open, taking in his surroundings. Bill Weasley crouched next to his beautiful fiancée, wondering for the millionth time how he had managed to get so lucky with the attractive French witch. Fleur had told him it was his boyish charm, though he suspected that he was not affected by her Veela charm as other men were. Yet another perk from being a curse breaker, he reasoned. He did a quick check to make sure all his charges were in place. He knew they were going to have a very easy time of it. There weren't many places to run off to in this old automobile graveyard. He did think it was a good idea that his father had been sent to the shoreline up north. Mr. Weasley would never be able to stop inspecting the old wreck. 5 minutes, my love. Fleur said softly. Bill took a deep calming breath and kept his eyes on their man who was to be the bait. Victor Krum shouted last-minute orders to his group and rolled his shoulders in preparation. He looked at Yvonne, and gave a wry smile, which his lifelong friend mirrored, and they both turned to watch as their triggerman took up position next to the cliff edge, broom at the ready. How much time? Yvonne asked. 4 minutes. Krum said. Tracy, I need more blood replenishes over here. Mrs. Weasley pointed to a spot near her. Susan, you and Astoria be ready with fresh towels when any of us calls for them. Make sure no one is blocking the floor or the front door. Tracy shouted to 2 third-year boys who brought all the potion vials they could carry and set them on the small table next to Tracy, who was organizing them for easier access for the healers who were preparing the rows of beds. 3 minutes. Mrs. Weasley whispered as her eyes caught sight of the clock above the mantel. Tonks readied her wand to cast the anti-apparition wards. She saw Sebastian Delacour making one last sweep of the area. She felt truly lucky to be partnered with the Frenchman, who was not only quite charming, but very funny. She just could not wait until the day was over. Sebastian had promised to tell her a very funny tale about his first assignment where he'd ended up with the transfigured horses behind which could not be reversed for several weeks. 2 minutes, folks. This is it. She shouted as Fred Weasley gave her a tap on the shoulder to signal the time. Amelia could feel the tension building. They had scouted the areas, planned the strike to its finest detail. But the truth was, no one was sure that this was really going to work like Harry Potter seemed sure that it would. Yet, she had to hope. If they pulled this off, the war was all but over. 1 minute to go. George Weasley smiled, raising his wand and aiming it from behind the boulder he shared with Amelia. The former head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement closed her eyes and took a deep breath, wishing again that Sirius was at her side for this one. It had been so long since any of the Death Eaters felt the twinge and pull on their magic of some rebellious usurper who dared utter their lord's name in defiance. As such, they had grown complacent, and soft. No one was exactly sure how their master had managed such a feat, but he'd made his own name a taboo. A curse of sorts. If the name was uttered by someone who did not bear his mark, those Death Eaters closest to the position could use the mark as a sort of porte-clés, and deal with the upstart. The Dark Lord had made it clear that if you felt the alarm, as he called it, you should go at once, no matter how many of them felt the pull. The more of his soldiers there to deal with the problem, the farther the fear of using the name would spread. No one dared question the order, especially not when there was a sudden surge of alarms throughout the country. At once, over 300 faithful dropped what they were doing and immediately apparate away, leaving their posts at the ministry and Hogwarts. Weeks later, and for years after, those left behind not associated with the Dark Lord and his ilk would swear they knew that the tide turned in those moments after the great call. Sirius cringed when he made the first count. They hadn't expected so many, though they should have. His group was closest to London, after all. In all, Sirius was sure that they had at least 70 of the Dark Lord's forces. The Death Eaters surged into the forest clearing, just as had been hoped by the Order leaders, himself included, and after the last crack of apparition, and a slow count of 20. Sirius felt a small sense of relief when the wards went up, and the battle commenced. The trigger man, the volunteer who had uttered the name of Voldemort at the appointed time, had easily gotten under cover just as the first Death Eaters arrived. The Dark Lord's sheep herded themselves into the Order's trap, and found themselves in a crossfire. Sirius saw the idiots try and apparate away only to look shocked that they were stuck. Sirius himself fired the first bone-shattering hex which signaled the fight was on. The Order gave no quarter to the Death Eaters, and in just minutes, half of their force was dead or dying. The Order remained under their cover, popping up and firing from their hiding spots. Some would cast Confutus charms, while others shot to kill. The Death Eaters were so overwhelmed by the Order's guerrilla tactics they had no real response. One by one they fell until in only 10 minutes, the battle was won, and the Order began to crawl out of their hiding spots to police the battle zone and find any survivors that might be willing to trade information for their lives. Bill Weasley ordered the darkness powder, and his forces pelted the narrow corridor between wrecked autos with chunks of instant darkness powder provided by his twin siblings. Bill had counted only a handful of Death Eaters, 10 at most. When the bombardment spells ceased, and the smoke cleared, Bill knew that there was no one left to question. In fact, there was hardly anything left that could be positively identified as human. Tonks had not been able to get the wards up as they had planned. 4 Death Eaters had apparate right on top of her and Fred Weasley. Tonks had managed to hold them off for several moments, but then things went pear-shaped as more and more Death Eaters appeared. Her troops had to break from their positions to try and contain their foes, but the Death Eaters, though taken by surprise, seemed to fight together well. Tonks avoided a killing curse, and managed to save Fred from one as well. "I think we stuck our foot in this one," Tonks yelled over the chaos at Fred, who was rummaging in the large rucksack he'd brought with him. "What are you doing?" she screamed as a flash of purple sheared off a large chunk of the boulder they'd taken refuge behind. "Back up," Fred called, holding up a galleon. "Now that's how it's done," Moody hollered triumphantly as he stood over a gasping Death Eater. Moody stomped his fake leg down on the wand lying beside the robed figure and ground his heel into the splintered wood. He looked every which way to make sure that other than his new prisoner, the rest of her fellows were dead. His team of 40 had easily dispatched the 50 or so Death Eaters who'd fallen for their trap. Moody was going to buy that Potter kid a whole case of Ogden's Finest just as soon as the war was over. The plan had been one of the best Moody had heard in quite some time, and with the help of the Order, and by and large the Buggerian contingent, it had been executed perfectly. Now, so far as Moody was concerned, they only had to find that snake-faced bastard and let Potter have at him. "You too," Moody bellowed, motioning for 2 of his Bulgarian troops over. "Bind this one and get him ready for interrogation." Moody bent down and tore the mask away from the Death Eater's face. "So good to see you, Alecto. I'm looking forward to chatting with you." Moody laughed, though it sounded like a growl. He gave a quick motion of his head and the 2 strapping Bulgarians dragged the stocky woman away. At that moment, Moody felt something warm on his thigh. He fished in his pocket and pulled out the fake galleon that Harry Potter's brilliant little witch friend had provided them all the day before. "Damn it, Nymphadora!" Moody snarled before calling some of his troops to him. "That's all of them, I think," Laurent Boutin said in a thick French accent as he and his assigned partner walked up to Remus Lupin, who was surveying the bodies as they were brought together by his troops. There had been so few. Remus wondered if the other teams had been as lucky. "Any survivors?" Remus asked, and Laurent shook his head. "We overwhelmed them. Between the bombardments, blasters, and confound's charms, they were all but defenseless. We have gathered all the wands, Mr. Lupin," a tall barrel-chested man said, his fist full of wands held out for Remus' inspection. "Burn them," Remus said with a nod. "Burn them and the bodies, then when it's all done, we'll head back to the island." I dash. He stopped as his chest grew warm, or more specifically, the galleon he'd placed in his chest pocket grew warm. Remus threw his hand into the pocket, fishing for the communication device. He read the edge of the gold coin, his heart beginning to beat faster. "Laurent, gather everyone. We've got to go help one of the groups. We need to go right now." Arthur Weasley had been utterly beside himself with fright before the battle had been started. He kept praying that he would make it through the battle unscathed. When it was all said and done, not only had he only cast a single spell, a reducto, but he was quite literally in the very same condition that he arrived in. Not only that, but the rest of his team was just fine as well. Perhaps it was the fact that only 10 Death Eaters had shown up. His force was coming out of hiding and quickly relieving the dead of their wands. "Well," he sighed. "Molly will be pleased. I might even get lucky tonight." He chortled as he headed over to meet up with his second-in-command to get a report. "All dead," the man with the thin beard exclaimed as Arthur toddled up. Arthur felt awful that he couldn't remember the man's name, though he was sure it was something like Stan, or Stern. Something like that. "Very good. Police the bodies, burn the wands." Arthur felt his leg grow warm, and he remembered the emergency communication galleon Hermione had handed out the night before. Ingenious, that young lady. The wizard world sure had been given a gift when she had come to Hogwarts, of that Arthur had no doubt. Fishing out the galleon, he read the edge, frowning at once. "Stan," he called out to his second. Stenson. Oh bother. My name is Volkov," the Bulgarian sighed, and Arthur's face grew red. "Sorry, my friend, I promise I'll remember this time. Gather everyone. Tonks needs help." "How quickly is that thing supposed to work?" Tonks screamed as another spell exploded behind her. She shot a glance over her shoulder to where Sebastian Delacour was pinned down with one of the French heat wizards. Instantly. Fred shouted. "But if they're all still engaged?" A scream sounded shrill over the explosions, and Tonks saw a young Bulgarian woman, who she was sure couldn't have been more than 20, fall dead. "They're closing the circle," someone shouted. "Blast you, Remus, if you ever want to see me Starkers again, you'll get your furry behind here now and save me," Tonks thought as she tried to fire a hex around the boulder. Only to very nearly lose her hand. "How many of them do you think there are?" Fred asked. "I have no idea, let me ask them to stop fighting with us so I can count." Tonks snapped. Crack. "Oh gods, I hope that not more of them," Tonks thought to herself. Crack. Crack. "Behind us. They've got reinforcements." "Who said that?" Tonks asked, but Fred only shrugged. The battlefield suddenly came alive with the cracks of apparition. That was followed by more explosions and screams. The Death Eaters that had been keeping Tonks and Fred at bay stopped firing on them and seemed to be distracted. Tonks and Fred both took advantage, popping up and hitting the two closest robed figures with bone-breaking hexes. It took another 20 minutes until the last spell was fired. But it became apparent quite quickly that backup had arrived for the order, and the tide of the battle changed almost at once. Slowly, as silence began to fall, Tonks rose from her hiding spot along with Fred. They were greeted at once their friends and allies. Dora. It was Remus. He was running through the trees looking for his lover. Remus. She shouted, running to her werewolf lover and leaping into his arms. They came from behind us, she said, kissing him hard. We never had a chance to get the wards up. We expected them to come from over there. We were all turned around. Start gathering the bodies, Moody shouted, coming from the forest. Anyone still alive, tie 'em up and bring them to me. How'd you fare, Mad Eye? Arthur Weasley asked as he came closer. We got 50 of the blighters. They came in right where we predicted they would. Moody grinned. We had to adjust our tactics, but we only had 10 to deal with. Arthur nodded. We took 70 ourselves. Sirius smiled, clapping Remus on the back. Any prisoners? Electo Caro. Moody was practically bouncing on his feet. We got 20 ourselves, Bill Weasley said as he and Fleur, walking hand in hand, approached. Anyone heard from Amelia? There was silence as everyone stared at each other. Should we go check on her? Fred asked. She might need our help, Bill remarked. Orders were pretty specific, Moody said. Don't come unless called. We'd do better to finish up here and get our wounded back to the island. I don't like it. Sirius shook his head. It's war, Moody snarled. We follow orders. Get back to the island. Wait for word, Moody said, clapping Sirius on the shoulder. I've seen the woman fight, you have too. Until we know for sure, we shouldn't worry ourselves. Easier said than done. Sirius grimaced, holding his own communication galleon tightly in his hand. Come on, Sirius, Remus said, grabbing his old friend by the shoulder. She might already be waiting for us. Amelia Bones could not believe her luck. Not only had her team managed to take on a force twice their size, but they had managed to capture Yaxley, Roll, and McNair. She watched with her wand aimed at McNair. They had been relieved of their wands, and forced to watch as they were snapped. You'll get nothing from us, bitch, Yaxley spat. Amelia shook her head. Well, see what you have to say after a dose of Veritaserum. Amelia smirked. She turned to George Weasley. Any word from the other teams? None since the galleon heated up. Okay, let's get these three to the rendezvous point, and then we'll figure out what's next. George nodded and turned to order their wounded back to the island. Several of the troops snatched up their prisoners and apparate away. Amelia followed shortly after, making sure that each and every one of her people headed back, before she allowed herself the privilege. She arrived at the agreed-upon point just after the prisoners had arrived. She was greeted by Sirius, who swept her up in his arms and spun happily. I was so worried, he said into her hair, holding her tightly. She felt the same, and kissed him to show her relief. How many did we lose? She asked when Sirius allowed her to pull away. I know Tonks' team got hit hard. We couldn't get free to help. It's all right. She's fine. She's in the tent with Moody and Remus. Moody's team got Electo Caro. We lost a total of 6. 5 were hurt, and are already back on the island. I lost one, and 3 wounded. Amelia sighed. Any word from Harry? I was just about to check. Go ahead. Amelia said, kissing Sirius once again. I'm going to assist Moody with the interrogations. I want to get all the information we can before we make our final strike. Amelia smiled at Sirius as he turned to make contact with Harry. She met with the other leaders, including Tonks, and got the final reports. They had decimated the Death Eaters. The tide had turned significantly. It was hard not to be excited. The end to their terror, to their war, was so very, very near. And they still had much to plan. Lord Voldemort arrived back at Hogwarts angrier than he'd ever felt in his life. Every single one of his Horcruxes was missing, at least those he could check on. The locket was gone. The ring as well. He knew that the diary had been destroyed, he'd learned of that upon his resurrection. He was on his way to the Room of Requirement to check on the diadem. So far as he knew, the cup was safe, deep inside Hogwarts, and he knew of no way the brat would get his hands on it. Yet, the Potter boy always somehow managed to accomplish the impossible. He was met by Snape, who looked quite grim. My lord, I'm afraid I have some very disturbing news. What is it, Snape? There was a battle, with the Order. How many did we kill? Voldemort asked, walking swiftly. So far as I'm aware. None. Snape said. Voldemort stopped in his tracks. He turned his cold red eyes on the defense teacher, who cowered a bit under his master's eyes. What? Voldemort hissed. I am unclear on the details. Only 3 returned, and they are being treated currently in the hospital wing. According to Flint, the Order was waiting for them. An ambush. Go to the hospital wing and wait for me there. Lord Voldemort snarled. He turned and moved off to finish his task. Somehow, before he even opened the hidden entrance, he knew. He had known when he went to the old shack, he had known when he returned to that ancient cave. And now, as he entered the cavernous room filled with hidden, broken, and lost objects, he knew that he would not find the diadem. He roared in frustrated anger when he'd come upon the bust of the ugly wizard. His protections were lost, destroyed. Rage filled his veins, boiling his blood. He stormed his way back to the hospital wing, students scattering before him, hoping to avoid his ire. Snape! He bellowed as he slammed open the doors of the hospital wing. Snape bowed at once. He was standing beside the bed of a young man, one of the newly initiated, who looked as if he'd been hit with a very nasty bone breaker. Blood was slowly flowing out of a large wound where bone was sticking out of his thigh, and the man shivered. Lord Voldemort stepped over to the young soldier and stared into his eyes. Through the connection, the Dark Lord saw a battle. His Death Eaters fought brilliantly, and it appeared that they were winning, and then, the Order suddenly had reinforcements, and the coward was hit and apparate back to Hogwarts. They are emboldened. Voldemort snarled. We need to prepare. They will try to attack again. Snape, give me your arm. Snape rolled up his sleeve and presented the dark mark for his master. Voldemort touched the charm tattoo. He then went to the Great Hall to await his followers, and then, he would find the Order and wipe them out. And then he would hunt down that accursed Potter boy and rip his body to shreds, but not until after he brutally slaughtered the boy's friends and made him watch. Please like and subscribe.